In 2024, airplane accidents resulted in more than 300 deaths, making it the deadliest year since 2018, especially in the final week of the year when two major air disasters occurred within just days of each other, contrasting sharply with 2023, which was regarded as the safest year in aviation history with no major passenger plane accidents. In 2024, some of these disasters were unavoidable accidents, while others should never have happened. From missile attacks to runway collisions, let's review 2024 and re-examine several fatal aviation accidents. On January 2nd, 2024, a Japan Airlines Airbus A350 was making its final approach at Tokyo Haneda Airport, and the flight was going smoothly. The plane was instructed to land on runway 34 right. At the same time, a Japan Coast Guard bombardier aircraft was taxiing, preparing to execute a mission delivering relief supplies to earthquake-affected areas. The aircraft had already been delayed by 40 minutes. As the bombardier aircraft moved along the taxiway, the air traffic controller instructed it to proceed to the C point, which was the primary waiting area for aircraft awaiting further instructions before entering the runway. The instruction indicated that the aircraft was the first in line for departure, but this did not grant permission to enter the runway. However, the crew of the bombardier misinterpreted the instruction and continued taxiing, passing the C point, and entered runway 34 right without permission. Meanwhile, Japan Airlines Flight 516 was preparing to land on the same runway. At this moment, the air traffic controller, busy directing multiple planes, did not notice that the bombardier had crossed the C point and entered the runway. Inside the cockpit of Flight 516, the pilots were following the standard procedure for landing, and the bombardier was in their blind spot. At that moment, the runway conflict alert popped up on the controller's screen, warning that the runway was occupied by another aircraft. However, the system often gave false alarms, warning when planes were still at a safe distance, causing controllers to habitually ignore these alerts. The pilots of Flight 516, unaware of the situation, continued to descend according to plan. It wasn't until the final seconds that the bombardier appeared within the landing lights range of Flight 516. As the plane descended, the pilots could no longer maneuver the aircraft to go around. At 17:47 local time, the left engine of the Airbus A350 collided with the tail of the bombardier, instantly igniting a massive fire. The bombardier was destroyed instantly, and of the 6 crew members on board, only the captain survived. The Airbus A350, trailing flames and smoke, skidded along the runway for nearly a kilometer before veering off the runway and heading towards the grass. Passengers inside the cabin experienced intense impacts, followed by chaos. Smoke quickly filled the cabin. Thanks to the crew's swift reaction, all 367 passengers and 12 crew members successfully evacuated in 11 minutes, though the entire aircraft was completely destroyed. This also became the first total loss of an Airbus A350 since it entered service in 2015. Investigators later determined that the tragic accident was caused by miscommunication, human error, and the failure to detect that the bombardier had entered the runway. On December 25, 2024, an Embraer 190 aircraft from Brazil took off from Baku, with its destination being Grozny, Russia, on Azerbaijan Airlines Flight 8243. There were 62 passengers and 5 crew members aboard. About 40 minutes after takeoff, Flight 8243 entered Russian airspace. As the plane neared Grozny, the weather began to deteriorate, and the crew reported a GPS signal loss. The aircraft's SB signal soon disappeared, which is a clear sign of GPS interference. In recent years, GPS interference in Russian-controlled airspace has become a growing problem due to electronic warfare measures. Despite this, the pilots continued the approach and were cleared to land at Grozny Airport. However, dense fog at the airport reduced visibility, forcing the crew to abort the first landing attempt. The pilots made a second approach, but were still unable to land. They then informed air traffic control that they decided to return to Baku. However, just as the plane was turning around, disaster struck. Passengers reported hearing a loud bang, followed by shrapnel tearing through the cabin. The plane was hit by a missile. The missile came from the Russian military's Armor U.S. air defense system, a short-range surface-to-air missile platform specifically designed to intercept aerial threats. The missile exploded near the tail of the plane, with high-speed fragments piercing the fuselage. The crew did not initially realize the severity of the damage and mistakenly believed the collision was caused by a bird strike. They requested an emergency course change and set their transponder to the emergency code 7700, which is used globally to alert air traffic control and nearby aircraft to a crisis. The pilots initially considered diverting to Mineralnie Vody Airport, but decided instead to head to the Uittash Airport in Makhachkala, Dagestan, after receiving a report of adverse weather conditions. However, the weather in Makhachkala was also worsening, so they had to reconsider. With few viable diversion options left, they ultimately decided to head to Aktau, Kazakhstan. At 10:02 local time, Flight 8243 entered Kazakhstan's airspace and reappeared on the SB tracking system, flying west toward Aktau International Airport. At this point, the aircraft was in an unstable flight state, and control was becoming increasingly difficult. The pilots attempted an emergency landing, but failed to stabilize the approach, and were forced to go around. Their second landing attempt also failed. At 10:30 local time, during the third attempt, the crew lost contact with air traffic control. Seconds later, the aircraft crashed 3 kilometers from Aktau International Airport, with its right wing touching the ground first, causing the fuselage to roll and break apart. The crash instantly erupted in fire, engulfing the front of the fuselage, while the tail remained relatively intact, eventually lying outside the main wreckage. Of the 67 people on board, 38 perished, including 2 pilots and 1 flight attendant, while the remaining 29 survived, though most were seriously injured. Most of the survivors were seated in the tail section, which was riddled with perforations, similar to the damage caused by a surface-to-air missile. Investigations revealed that the Russian military was intercepting Ukrainian drone attacks at the time and may have mistakenly hit the passenger plane. Survivors confirmed that high-speed fragments pierced the cabin, injuring multiple passengers and crew members. On July 24, 2024, a Bombardier CRJ-200 regional jet was performing a flight from Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu, Nepal, to Pokhara. There were 19 people aboard, including 2 pilots and 16 airline technicians. The plane had been grounded for 34 days prior to this flight. On that morning, technicians performed a recovery operation check and approved the aircraft for flight. The latest weather report showed 8 kilometers of visibility, with scattered clouds at 1,000 feet and 3,000 feet, with a few clouds. At 11:10 a.m., the plane taxied to the end of runway 02, turned around, and began accelerating for takeoff. However, as the plane took off, it exhibited unstable motion. The plane first tilted to the right, then suddenly rolled sharply to the left, followed by another right side roll. Seconds later, the plane's right wingtip hit the ground, causing the fuselage to continue sliding forward, crashing into a cargo container, and then falling into a 40-meter deep canyon near the airport. The impact sparked a massive fire, and thick smoke billowed from the wreckage. Firefighters arrived on the scene within a minute and quickly began firefighting and rescue operations. Out of the 19 people on board, 18 died, and only the captain survived. The 2 flight data recorders were sent to Singapore for analysis by the Nepal Aviation Accident Investigation Committee. A preliminary report released in September 2024 found that the aircraft experienced excessive nose-up during takeoff, with the climb rate far exceeding normal levels. Investigators also found gaps in the airline's operational procedures, including improper loading and inaccurate performance calculations. The report showed a huge discrepancy between the recorded takeoff speed and the calculated value, raising serious concerns about the airline's safety management. On August 9, 2024, an ATR-72 turboprop aircraft operating a flight from Cascavel to São Paulo Guarulhos International Airport, Flight 2283 of Vopas Airlines, was carrying 58 passengers and 4 crew members. A flight advisory had been issued along the route warning of significant ice risks between 12,000 and 21,000 feet. Meteorological reports confirmed the presence of severe turbulence, thunderstorms, and substantial icing in the area. Icing on the aircraft can greatly affect flight safety by increasing drag, reducing lift, and interfering with flight controls. Severe icing can cause a loss of aerodynamic performance, making it impossible for the aircraft to maintain controlled flight. At 1:18 p.m., Flight 2283 contacted São Paulo's approach control and was cleared to enter the CENPA waypoint at a cruising altitude of 17,000 feet. However, just 2 minutes later, the situation quickly deteriorated, and a stall warning sounded. The plane first tilted to the left, then sharply rolled to the right. Despite the captain's efforts to recover, the aircraft lost lift and entered an uncontrollable spin. In a final desperate attempt, the crew increased engine thrust. The plane had entered an irreversible descent, plummeting at an astonishing rate of 24,000 feet per minute. At 1:22 p.m., the radar signal disappeared, and the aircraft crashed in a residential area in Vinhedo, São Paulo, about 76 kilometers from the destination. All 58 passengers and 4 crew members died. After the accident, Brazil's Center for Aviation Accident Investigation and Prevention launched an investigation. The 2 flight data recorders were successfully recovered and sent to a lab for analysis. A preliminary report confirmed severe icing on the aircraft's wings. The crew made several attempts to activate the de-icing system, but flight data showed that the system failed to operate correctly. On November 25, 2024, a Boeing 737 freighter of Dunhao Airlines was performing a cargo mission. The aircraft encountered an accident as it approached Vilnius International Airport. A preliminary report showed that shortly after beginning its descent, the crew reported an unknown emergency to air traffic control. Witnesses reported the aircraft's engine making abnormal noises before it descended at an unusually steep angle. A few minutes later, the freighter crashed into a residential area a few kilometers north of Vilnius International Airport. The local government confirmed, supported by surveillance footage, that the plane had been in controlled descent for some time before rapidly losing altitude. 1 crew member died and 3 others were injured. The Lithuanian Aviation Authority and Dunhao Airlines' safety team began an investigation. The air traffic control recordings revealed that the crew had issued a distress call, but failed to provide specific details about the emergency before communication was lost. 2 flight data recorders were successfully recovered and are expected to provide key data to help investigators piece together the events leading to the crash. On December 29, 2024, a Boeing 737 aircraft of Jeju Air, South Korea, crashed at Muan International Airport in South Jeolla Province, South Korea. This was the worst aviation disaster in the country in decades. The flight had been uneventful until the final approach phase. Air traffic control had warned the crew of a bird strike hazard, indicating possible bird activity. During the approach, the aircraft deviated from its flight path several times, but quickly returned to the correct course, likely in an attempt to avoid a flock of birds. The aircraft's airspeed remained stable, and the descent rate was within normal limits. 2 minutes later, the crew declared an emergency due to the bird strike and initiated a go-around. After the go-around, the crew followed standard procedures to retract the flaps and landing gear, requesting to land on the opposite runway. This indicated that the crew wanted to land as soon as possible, suggesting the situation was very urgent. After a 180-degree turn, the crew decided to land on runway 19, but failed to extend the flaps and landing gear. The reason for the failure of the flaps and landing gear to deploy is still under investigation. The plane landed without flaps, causing the landing speed to be much higher than normal.